Welcome today to our Secretary Speakers Series entitled Between Two States, the Tahoe Advisory Science Council. I'm Wade Crowfoot, our California Natural Resources Secretary, joined by a pretty incredible panel. And we're going to spend the next hour talking about one of our most beloved places, Lake Tahoe and the Lake Tahoe Basin, and specifically our scientific efforts to better understand and manage the lake and the basin, and a group that's formed from our efforts in Nevada and California to help translate scientific understanding into improved resource management, and that is called the Tahoe Scientific Advisory Council, or the Tahoe Science Advisory Council, I should say. So today we're going to hear from some key leaders on this issue. Welcome, Brad Crowell. Brad serves as the director of the Nevada's Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, my equivalent, my partner on management of our state properties and resources around the lake. We've got Bob Larson, who serves as program officer, staffing the TSAC, or the Tahoe Science Advisory Council. And then we have two eminent scientists, Dr. Jeff Schladow, who is one of the world's experts on freshwater lakes, unique places like Lake Tahoe, who has been doing work for quite a long time to help us understand how Lake Tahoe operates and how it's changing. And then Dr. Pat Manley, who works for the United States Forest Service, who is leading the scientific charge, better understanding our upland ecosystems across the basin. The beautiful peaks and forests that you see in her background. So we're going to start off with some broad conversation around the role that Tahoe plays and how we are working to preserve it. And then we'll hear from Dr. Schladow and Dr. Manley about key scientific questions being asked and answered in the lake and across the basin. And then we'll have an opportunity to talk about how this advisory council is really trying to link science and management. And we invite you to share thoughts, suggestions, questions, and you can do so by using the button at the bottom of your screen to get a Q&A in our queue. So before I turn it over to our panelists, I'll just share my perspective on Lake Tahoe. I love my job as our resources secretary. And one of the best things about it is the opportunity to play some type of role in conserving natural gems like Lake Tahoe. And the lake and the basin are truly one of our most special places across California. And as Brad knows, it's also a natural gem of Nevada, because of course the lake and the basin is divided among two states, several counties and towns and incorporated areas, and any number of state, federal, and local agencies. And we're really excited to be able to steward Lake Tahoe and take advantage of opportunities to work together and also address challenges. So, really for us and with respect to Lake Tahoe, our broad statewide priorities are reflective of what we're trying to get done in Lake Tahoe, which is build climate resilience of the lake and the basin to changes from climate change, to maintain the remarkable biodiversity and environmental balance of the lake and the basin, to maintain and improve equitable recreational access to the lake, and to deal with transportation, recognizing that Tahoe has become so popular that in some respects, it's in danger of being loved to death. And so we're working on trying to better understand how we can maintain the natural systems in the lake and the basin while providing the incredible recreational experience for as many Californians and Nevadans as we can. So that's really the work before us. And Brad, that's where our partnership comes in. So I'm interested to hear from you about what Lake Tahoe means to you, to Governor Sisolak and your department, and what your vision is for this scientific partnership that we've initiated.
Thank you, Wade, and thank you for inviting us to this speaker series today. Again, for everyone's information, my name is Brad Kroll. I'm the director of the Nevada Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. which includes Nevada's work vis-a-vis Tahoe on protecting the natural environment in Tahoe for the benefit of all Nevadans and Californians and the visitors that come there every year. Tahoe receives more visitation than I think all of or most of our national parks around the country, but doesn't necessarily enjoy the same level of protection or targeted funding. It is, Nevada is obviously shares the longest border with California, so we have lots in common, but really Tahoe is where our common bonds are often built. But in order to manage Tahoe for the benefit of all of us now and future generations, it takes a lot of coordination. Obviously split between two states, there needs to be coordination there. The federal government plays a significant role in Tahoe issues. There's 5 counties across the 2 states that touch Tahoe, as well as many local municipalities. That creates both challenges and opportunities, but Wade and I and our predecessors have worked hard to have good coordination between the 2 states and all the things that we do in Tahoe. And we are lucky to have that work that we do in Tahoe built on a foundation of good, expert, world-class science. And that's what we're hoping to talk about today, is how we're using that science to apply it to our management efforts in Tahoe to protect the unique environment up there. With climate change, it's obviously impacting the lake. Not every aspect of climate change is within our control in terms of its impacts on the lake, but we are working to identify those that we can manage and to mitigate the ones that are impacting our region more broadly. And I really look forward, well, first, I really appreciate the partnership with Secretary Crowfoot and our partners in California, and really look forward to hearing from the scientists today about how we are looking at Tahoe from a science perspective and how we are turning that into good, smart, and strategic management and policy decisions. So, Wade, thank you again for having us.
Thank you, Brad. And you and I have talked about this before, but I think this is a real opportunity for our 2 states to actually work together and make a lot of progress building climate resilience. We want to applaud Governor Sisolak and your administration for advancing a climate action plan in Nevada. And I think our governors have actually had a chance up in Tahoe at our annual Tahoe Summit to really share priorities on stewardship for the lake. And I just remarked that we're really very much aligned on everything we're trying to get done. And a special thanks to you. You're sort of the senior senator, as it were, in this partnership, given that your tenure is longer. And you explained to me that when I started, it was actually former Secretary Laird, who was in my position, who had sort of taken you under his wing and helped educate on this bi-state partnership in Tahoe. And in turn, you did that with me. So really excited to continue to work together. And thanks a ton for your leadership and passion on this. I'll note that you and I, and probably everybody in this discussion, loves Tahoe as a regular person. And I count one of my happiest memories of a difficult 2020 actually camping with my family at DL Bliss State Park. And I know you love an opportunity to get up there as well. So we do this work, obviously, as professionals in our day jobs, but also because we love this as Nevadans and Californians. So Bob, I want to turn it to you. You were recruited into the first ever position as program officer, staffing or supporting this Tahoe Science Advisory Council. And your background is working with the Tahoe Conservancy within our agency, which is doing a lot of great work on conservation and so many other priorities in Tahoe. So talk a little bit about what brings you to the work, and then the role that TSAC is trying to play in our management of Tahoe.
Yeah, thanks very much, Wade, and thanks again for hosting us today. I think it's great to have an opportunity to have this conversation, and yeah, really look forward to the discussion today. I've been working in Tahoe in restoration and regulation for close to 20 years now, and worked with the scientists that are participating today, as well as others, for a number of years working on water quality issues. And I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of step in and join the team that's working on this bi-state council. So I guess what I'd like to do is just share a little bit about some of the history of where science has been here in the basin, and then talk about the structure of the council, And hopefully that'll kind of frame the conversation that we're going to be having for the rest of the day. You guys have both talked about how special Tahoe is, and it really is an awesome place. It's a fantastic location. I feel really fortunate to live and work here. And we also know that Lake Tahoe is fragile. You know, Wade, you talked about sort of it being loved to death, and visitors have been coming to Tahoe for decades, but it really was kind of the 1960 Winter Olympics that brought new attention to this area. And with that attention came some increased development, more roads, more ski resorts, casinos, and just generally more stress on the environment. We're really lucky, however, that Lake Tahoe has an uncommonly long partnership between scientists and managers. And by the time these development pressures began threatening the lake, researchers were already collecting data. Dr. Charles Goldman with UC Davis started his work here at Tahoe more than 60 years ago. He was the first that really documented the declining conditions and kind of raised the alarm bell. And his work drove some really critical management action, not the least of which was a legislation in the late 70s that required the export of all sewage in the watershed. So before that time, we were discharging sewage to the lake essentially. And so again, really kind of kicked off, I think, the era of conservation and protection at Tahoe. Dr. Goldman's work is also arguably responsible for the Bi-State Compact that established the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency and the partnership that you and Brad were just discussing. It's unique to have this type of kind of bi-state partnership and a single watershed for protection. And the TRPA is serving that role to protect this watershed. Worth noting that compact celebrated its 50th anniversary recently, and I'm just happy to say that the Science Management Partnership at Tahoe that kind of started that whole relationship is still going strong. So I guess a couple other things, forest management has always been part of the discussion as well. It was really in the early 80s that Tahoe experienced some of the first widespread forest beetle kills in the state, and Tahoe began grappling with kind of the forest challenges that have been left behind by the history of widespread logging that was then followed by fire suppression. And so some of the forest issues that are, we're really grappling with now are, started, I think, then, and, we're seeing throughout the state and the nation. In the 90s, in the early 2000s, our academic partners helped us understand what was going on with Lake Tahoe's clarity, right? We knew clarity was declining, but it was good to really dive into the issue and start to understand, what were the causes and what could we do about it. That plan that I was involved with is known as the Lake Tahoe Total Maximum Daily Load, and it's really one of the scientifically robust of its kind and a demonstration of the strong science partnership at Tahoe, and it really guides a lot of our work today. More recently, science partners have been leading the effort to evaluate Lake Tahoe's nearshore condition, which, is shown behind Jeff and I's heads right now, kind of looking closely at where folks really interact with the lake, and just continued to collect the data that really help us understand what's happening. I also want to note that, Pat and her team have been looking at helping to plan large landscape scale forest treatment efforts, really looking at bigger treatment throughout the landscape and looking at the forest as a whole system and how forest treatment systems are going to affect not only fire danger and risk, but also the overall ecosystem. So again, Tahoe kind of on the forefront of some of the forest science there. Looking at the council, there have been a lot of science organizations throughout the years. And 2015, the two states came together to create this Bi-State Science Advisory Council to kind of reaffirm that partnership and provide a venue for dialogue between scientists and managers. This council is a little bit different, right, in that it is really explicitly developed to inform the management decision. The council is made up of 2 members each from 6 institutions, and I'll just list those just so folks know kind of who's sitting on our council. University of Nevada, Reno, and the Desert Research Institute, also based out of Reno. The U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station, again, welcome Pat and thanks for being here. The United States Geological Survey, UC Davis, again, Dr. Schlado representing Davis today. And lastly, there are 2 University of California system-wide seats that are filled by the UC Santa Barbara folks right now. So I hope that kind of just gives a sense of history and where we are with the council structure. And I'll just close by saying and reiterating, I mean, you guys talked about it, but Tahoe is facing new threats. and the chief among them is climate change. Climate change is touching every facet of our watershed, whether it be the local economy, forest health, or the lake itself, and then outdoor recreation, right? It's booming. Transportation issues, visitor management. These are really becoming some of the priorities that we're really looking to leverage council expertise to support in the future. So yeah, really looking forward to the conversation today. I think now more than ever, policymakers need these type of science management partnerships to help inform and work together to solve the issues that are facing us today.
Bob, thanks. I really appreciate that contemporary sort of historical tour of Lake Tahoe. And I just want to back up and suggest that as we look further back, any history, any cultural history of Lake Tahoe, of course, starts with the Washoe people who have stewarded the basin since time immemorial. And frankly, were chased out from the Lake Tahoe area over a century ago. So as we talk about improving the connection between science and management, that also includes integrating traditional ecological knowledge in ways that are supported by the Washoe tribe to really understand the practices that so effectively stewarded the environment for so long. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Schladow in a moment, and I'll share that when I migrated from the Midwest, when in my very early 20s, I saw a lot of bumper stickers that said "Keep Tahoe Blue," and I had no idea really what that was all about. But of course, I came to know that it was part of this movement around preserving the clarity of Lake Tahoe and the environmental balance in such a special lake. And Dr. Schladow, you and of course UC Davis and UNR have been really critical toward monitoring the condition of the lake over time and helping us unpack just how such a unique resource actually works. And I thank you for the summer before last actually getting me out on the lake and doing this famous Secchi disc reading where you actually drop something below the surface to understand the clarity. So I'm interested in your perspective on sort of the state of science in the lake. And if you would, because I imagine we have some here who really haven't spent much time thinking about the lake as a natural system, as you start sharing, if you could just talk about what makes Lake Tahoe, unique as a lake compared to so many other lakes in California, that'd be great. So over to you, Dr. Schladow.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Wade. Yeah, and thank you for the invitation to be here. So I guess I'm waiting for my PowerPoint slide. Here they come. Let me just skip through this one. And oh, sorry, I guess I don't have any. I have to ask for it to be advanced. So to answer your question, I thought it would be useful to have this map of Lake Tahoe and its watershed as the introductory slide, because in a way this does answer your question. Lake Tahoe is unique, and part of its uniqueness can be seen here. Maybe hard to make out the contours there, but the bottom of the lake goes down to 1,645 feet below the surface, and it's surrounded by a very small watershed. So unlike most lakes, say the Great Lakes, and all the lakes and reservoirs in the rest of California and Nevada, we have this incredibly small watershed that has no agricultural pressures, no mining pressures, currently no forestry pressures. And so what we have there is pretty much an attempt to preserve a somewhat pristine environment. Of course, what makes it less than pristine is largely the fact that, as some of you have alluded to already, the fact that we have people. We have a huge number of people, and people drive on roads and live in houses and stay at hotels and even camp in campgrounds. And all of that activity has an effect on the lake. So Tahoe is unique in that it has a potentially far more controllable set of stresses than many other lake systems. And the other reason I wanted to point this out is, when you're out in the middle of the lake, as I was with Wade a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, you can look around 360 degrees, and this is an amazing laboratory. And so as a scientist, it's a real privilege to work in a laboratory that isn't surrounded by four walls. It has the beautiful peaks in all directions. The final point there, the bottom point in the text on the left, is a 600-year retention period. Basically, that's the average amount of time a drop of water spends in Lake Tahoe, which would make somebody think, well, it's going to take 600 years to restore Lake Tahoe. What's the rush? Well, the rush is that it doesn't take 600 years for change to occur in Lake Tahoe. It's 1,645 feet deep, but as we'll see in a minute, most of our attention is focused on that top 70 feet, and that top 70 feet interacts with the rest of the lake and the rest of the watershed. So next slide, please. So here is that graph, that famous graph, started by Charles Goldman and continuing up. And so I guess one thing to get out of the way is that it isn't all about Secchi depth and all about clarity. Clarity is a sentinel. It integrates everything that's happening in the lake and in the watershed and expresses it as a very simple, very digestible number, essentially how far down into the lake you can see. And so what we do see here is that from the period of the mid-60s through to about the 90s, there was this pretty constant decline. This is that period of alarm when people were coming to the basin more and more. There were very few land controls. Things were pretty much out of control. I mean, the gratifying thing, and this is thanks to management actions and the funding that made those possible, federal, state, local, and even private funding, that curve, that decline in the Secchi disk depth has flattened out. The goal is to get it back to what it was in the 1960s, which is 30 meters or about 100 feet. So you can see we're a long way from there. We've actually plateaued to an extent. And so a lot of the questions now, a lot of the challenges are how do we get it back there? We seem to have slowed the decline, but are we really making progress on restoring it? Next slide, please. So this is a complex slide, but I'll try to walk you through it as best I can. But the theme of it is what I want you to walk away with virtually, is that climate change is impacting all processes, both in the lake and in the watershed. So moving, say, in a clockwise direction here, starting at about 10 o'clock, where you see that pipe discharging into the lake. Essentially, this is the, I guess, the process, the impact that Bob Larson was talking about before with the TMDL. Urban runoff flowing into the lake, primarily during the wintertime, and changing and altering the clarity of the lake. There's been a tremendous amount of effort put into staunching that flow, particularly of fine particles and of nutrients. But think about a future Lake Tahoe where we don't have snow necessarily as the dominant input of precipitation, but rain. We're going to get much larger inflow events. Are the management methods we're using now sufficient to deal with those? As we move around, say to 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, this is depicting the near shore. So there's a pipe there. People are actually taking water from the lake to drink. There's a non-filtration exemption for Tahoe. So keeping Tahoe clean has an economic impact beyond the $3 to $4 billion tourist industry. People use that water. Because of its purity, it's easy to treat. This slide, this picture as well indicates the interaction with the rest of the nearshore, away from the towns and the built-up areas where there's a lot of groundwater inflows. Again, groundwater is controlled by lake level and the snowpack. As snowpack changes in the coming decades, that whole balance of groundwater is going to change. A significant part of the inflows of nutrients and fine particles to the lake, moving around 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. The nearshore region of the lake has invasive species. We have shown here, shown the little white things at 5 o'clock, are Asian clams, which were introduced in the last probably 15 years. In and of themselves, they may not represent that much of a challenge to people, but they process nutrients. They concentrate nutrients, creating algal blooms that wash up on the beaches. So again, this is something that's important for the lake. And again, it too is being impacted by climate change. And finally, at 7 o'clock, just a depiction of the food web. Algae have changed on account of climate change. When the algae change, the zooplankton change, the fish change, everything has a cascading effect. We now know the smallest algae, ones that weren't there 40, 50 years ago, are having a dominant effect on clarity at certain times of years and in certain years. All of this compounded together changes the clarity. So sort of looking there in the middle of the graph where you see the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet penetrating down into the lake. But next to it, there's another line showing UV. UV is impacted by forest fires, which are exacerbated by climate change. So the idea is that it's all interconnected, the watershed, the lake, and as climate change starts exerting more and more of an influence, everything will continue to change. Next slide, please. So what are the priorities? And just before I list those, and this is not an exclusive list or a fully extensive list, that graph on the right just shows the climate change signal in the lake to date. And this is showing the annual average surface water temperature. And it's varying from around 50 degrees back in the late 60s to on average something like 52 degrees. But and you may think, oh, 2 degrees, what's the big deal? And Tahoe's so cold anyway. It'd be nice to have it warmer. This is the annual average. So this takes into account those cold months of winter where the temperature is 40 degrees. So the important thing is there is a long, persistent increase in lake temperature, more in summer, less in winter. But continuing here, what we're after, what the priority for science is a better mechanistic understanding of the impact of watershed inputs with climate change. What drives these things? What we do know from climate modeling is that, for example, right now, the peak in the hydrograph, the peak time for inflows to the lake is typically June. By the end of the century, it's likely that will be closer to January, something like a 4 to 5 month acceleration or advancement of when stream inflows are coming in. That water will have a different temperature. It will flow into the lake at a different level. It will impact the clarity. It will impact the dissolved oxygen at the bottom, things that we're only just starting to fully understand. So we want to know how those mechanistic effects impact the biology and the food webs of the lake. We already have evidence of changing phytoplankton. How's this going to affect zooplankton? How is zooplankton going to adapt? One way of understanding this is development of predictive models. It's one thing to be able to account for what's happened in the past. That's all very interesting, and scientists like myself love doing that. It's a lot harder to say what will happen in an uncertain future when we don't know the extent of climate change and societal adaptations and what we're going to do in the basin. So predictive tools that can take into account the best understanding of the physics and the biology and the ecology, but also trying to incorporate the range of things that we as a society, inside and outside of the Tahoe Basin, will do to try to counter climate change. And part of modeling is having data to validate, to calibrate models, And so new ways of collecting data and analyzing those data are a high priority. Next slide, please. So just to give you one example here, so many of you may be aware that lakes stratify. So this is a picture on the left is showing just showing a time series. So that's months of the year across the bottom, and depth of the lake, just the upper 250 feet of Lake Tahoe shown here. And the colors indicate the temperatures. And so in summer, you get the warm reddish colors there dominating. Because warm water, it has a different density than the cooler water underneath, it tends to separate, it tends to not mix, it tends to, I guess, not allow, for example, oxygen to be transported to the bottom of the lake. So this stratification period in the middle of the year is really important. What we've noticed just from the 50 years of data collection is that these summertime conditions, the stratification conditions, have increased something like 3 to 4 weeks in the last 50 years, and it's a zero-sum game. So if these summer-like conditions are extending, then there's less time for winter-like conditions when mixing that blue colors you see on the, say in the month of March, when deep mixing takes place, there's less time for that to happen. On the right, we're seeing output from a set of climate change models showing the length of this stratification period through the end of the century. The black line is the average of the 4 models that the state of California and the state of Nevada routinely used for these sorts of studies. And we see that the stratification length goes from about 200 days to something like 260 days by the end of the century under this particular climate scenario. So 2 more months of summer. Well, sounds good on the surface, but from the point of view of the lake, it's 2 less months of winter mixing and renewal. Next slide, please. Okay, this is, I think, the final slide. Management needs, or far be it from me to say what the management needs are, but I think what management knows it needs is for restoration activities and actions and planning to be based on the best available science. And this is something that's really been operative at Tahoe from the very beginning, as Bob described, but even more so since the first federal summit in 1997 when President Clinton and Vice President Gore were present, right through to the most recent summits. Every year there's a reaffirmation by elected officials, federal, state, and local, that the best available science is what's needed at science. That science is conducted largely by universities in the region and government research organizations like Pacific Southwest Research Station, where Pat is based. What TSAC does, though, is it provides this important function of helping prioritize and coordinate that science. As you know, scientists are an unruly lot sometimes, and getting that flow of information to agencies is something that needs to be done, and even to this day needs to be improved. So I think that's one of the key functions of TSAC that we're hoping to continue with over the coming years. The next slide, although I think that may be the last one. It is. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today.
Thanks so much, Dr. Schladow. Really helpful summary that distilled what is a lot of complexity in how the lake persists. So I'm going to have a few follow-up questions on the lake science side. But let's get over to Dr. Manley, who helps to lead research efforts, as Dr. Schladow said, at the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Research Station. And again, is spearheading this scientific understanding of the upland ecosystems that form the basin above the lake. Dr. Manley, welcome.
Thank you. You can start the slides anytime. Really delighted to be here this afternoon to talk to you about how some of the work we're helping to promote through the Bi-State Science Council, promoting research to support restoration and stewardship of the upland ecosystems in Lake Tahoe Basin and their intimate connection with the lake itself. Lake Tahoe is a place I've worked and lived over the past 30 years. Really a part of, shaped who I am and how I see the world. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today. I wanted to acknowledge some of the other council members that worked very closely together as part of our team to develop this research focus and agenda that I'll be talking to you about. Adrian Harpold, Sudeep Chandra, Max Moritz, and Adam Watts. So I just want to thank them for all their contributions. Next slide. So on the right, this iconic photo is a view of Lake Tahoe and the basin as it sits, as you would see it from the crest of the Sierra Nevada looking east. The lake in its totality is so beautiful. But the Lake Tahoe Basin is not just a pretty face, and that's what we're talking about today. It's complicated in a number of ways that really matter in terms of how we go about doing our research and managing it into the future. So on the plus side, it's biologically rich and really diverse for its high elevation. On the west side of the basin is the Sierra Nevada ecoregion, and on the east side is the Great Basin ecoregion. And both of these have really unique pools of plants and animal species that constitute these ecosystems, and those mix in the basin in really interesting ways. So in addition to that, it has 63 different primary watersheds all around the basin, that all of which empty into Lake Tahoe. They reach from the lake all the way up to the crest of 11,000 plus feet in elevation. And along that gradient are different elevational zones from montane, upper montane, subalpine, and alpine, each of which have individual species that are very characteristic of those zones and are in some cases unique to those zones. So we have a really diverse array of species, but actually small populations of those species due to the limited amount of suitable habitat because how variable it is around the basin. So its diversity is fragile. On the minus side, the Lake Tahoe Basin has a bit of a rocky history. In the late 1800s, there's extensive logging, commercial grazing, commercial fishing, as Bob mentioned, and all of these have had their impacts. And even into the 1900s, of course, nearly a century of fire suppression, exotic species introductions, and urban development. And as Jeff pointed out, some of the research from UC Davis, this notion that a drop of water that enters Lake Tahoe stays there for nearly 600 years. So in many respects, what happens in the basin stays in the lake for 600 years. So this is all to paint the picture of where we are today. Restoration over the past 50 years has made really great progress toward environmental quality and improving conditions that will be resilient into the future, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and we'll talk a bit about that. Next slide, please. So I want you to think about the Lake Tahoe Basin as an ecosystem, not as a place with trees and bears and fish and casinos, but as a whole system. And although it's not independent of the surrounding landscape, it is its own entity. It has an inherent constitution that's discrete and limited. For the Washoe tribe, as Wade mentioned, it's the center of the Washoe world. And so it's a sacred part of their past, their present, and their future. So this basin, its system, is an intricate web of people, plants, animals, ecological, social, cultural values, and it absorbs and responds to these many influences and external influences, with climate change being a notable impact. Next slide. So interestingly, this list is not from the Lake Tahoe Basin, but it is actually a list of characteristics that are most relevant to strategies for sustainable development in small island states. So it's this unique kind of understanding, really, that the Lake Tahoe Basin is much like an island in that it has many of the same vulnerabilities and dependencies of small systems. So this is an important context and perspective that we brought to our research in supporting long-term sustainability. Next slide. As we face climate change as a society, we need to come together and bring our best to our collaborative efforts towards solutions. In the research community, this question, we have a question about how can we develop and implement research that will have the greatest contribution to, possible to supporting a resilient future. So with that perspective, these are the tenets that we're bringing to this perspective in terms of upland ecosystems in the basin. First, this very high degree of interdependence among ecological and social systems. So upland and terrestrial systems, terrestrial dry systems and aquatic systems in these watersheds are very interactive. The upland ecosystems, these watersheds in Lake Tahoe, obviously highly interactive. And then environmental quality and community well-being, also very interactive and interdependent. So a robust ongoing science management partnership is really critical to increasing the pace and scale of restoration that will be successful in creating the outcomes that we're all hoping for. And effective monitoring is also essential given an uncertain and novel future that we face. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. So what are the drivers of change? We know where we are today. We kind of know what we'd like to see in the future. What's really driving change in the basin as we understand it into the future? Well, as many others have mentioned already, climate change is really looms large. It's documented in a recent Lake Tahoe Basin climate vulnerability assessment that the future climate will be quite challenging in terms of the resilience of these systems. Just touch on a few of the most important ones here in terms of upland systems. Effects on species and their interactions. So shifts in plant and animal species are expected, not necessarily in concert with one another, but individually. And what that means in terms of their ability to perform various functions and to maintain those populations over time, given their small population sizes, is a major question. In terms of the effects of climate on snow amount and dynamics, the amount of precipitation falling as snow is expected to decline approximately by 50% by the year 2100. This means not only the amount of moisture that will be available to forests and trees and people in the lake later in the season, but also actually the snow level itself in the basin and what that means in terms of recreation and other ecological processes. This change in precipitation and temperature is going to affect drought stress, flooding, and erosion. Extreme events are expected, which will affect sediment loading to streams and to Lake Tahoe, and also affect water supply and even water levels in Lake Tahoe itself, particularly during drought years. These then, in turn, will affect tree mortality rates and processes and extents, as well as the prevalence and extent of high severity fire. The extreme fire effects, has the possibility and the threat of impacting property as well as forests. It presents a challenge to restoring fire as a process in the basin. And it also presents some threats to carbon budgets and our goals for carbon sequestration. Recreation value and demand is expected to go up, particularly driven by population growth and people seeking, lower temperatures as the temperatures rise. And we've seen this already. It really drives people to cooler climates, which exist up in Tahoe. And so, as Bob and others mentioned, we're really trying to manage both expectations, demands, and quality of experience. And what does that mean for this delicate balance in the basin as a system? And then finally, management feasibility is really challenging because of the cost of doing restoration work and really ramping up to address the pace and scale, which is probably 4 to 5 to maybe even 10 times the degree of management we're currently able to implement in the basin, is really something that science does have a role to play there in terms of understanding how we might be able to tackle this feasibility issue. Next slide. So can management make a difference? This is kind of a new question. It used to be, how can we make a difference? But there's also questions about, can it make a difference with climate change really looming? Recent research led and conducted by PSW and some of our university partners, including the University of Nevada, Reno, we have shed some new light on how management can make a difference in improving upland conditions and making them more resilient to climate change. So the short answer, thankfully, is yes. There are many ways in which management can make a difference. I'll share a few of them here. Benefits resulting from forest management in the extent of high severity fire and property loss from fire are realized pretty significantly when treatments are implemented across the landscape. So maybe contrary to what one might think, that the best way to protect property in the wildland urban interface is to actually manage the entire landscape, the entire watershed. Second, the use of fire has demonstrated benefits for achieving many restoration objectives, and it's been shown that it really reduces the cost of management, which is one of those barriers to implementation over large geographic areas. Of course, fire has its own challenges, but these are important findings that help us understand, how to move forward with, a variety of limitations. And speaking of limitations, operational limitations, and in this case, I mentioned steeper slopes, but there are many, are being explored through research and technology to improve the proportion of the landscape that can be effectively managed and toward desired conditions. Finally, the land and water linkages are so important, and we tended in the past to treat them as separate entities with their own unique perspectives in terms of our desired outcomes, but in reality, they are very much intertwined. And so benefits resulting from forest management are really enhanced when they are designed with water dynamics in mind, not just structural outcomes in terms of forest conditions. And particularly when they're coupled with wetland ecosystem restoration activities within the watershed to have a whole watershed restoration outcome. And this is particularly relevant in Tahoe with the many meadows and interface, mixing of forest and meadow ecosystems throughout many of these watersheds. Next slide, please. So acknowledging that climate and human effects are really acting on this basin as a system, just want to call out a couple of focal areas as outcomes that our plan or our research agenda is focusing on: forest and fire, land and water linkages, and biodiversity. And then as these climate and human influences are acting on these systems, of course, these are all pooling into Lake Tahoe itself and into the communities that reside in the basin. So this whole system approach is still very much reflected in this graphic. So I'm going to talk about each of these focal areas and outcomes just very briefly. Next slide, please. So between forest and fire and land and water linkages, the kinds of topics that the research, we're seeing the need for initial research information and science management partnerships around tree stress and mortality. What's going to be driving those? To what degree are those a threat to the future of these systems? And what can management? How can we respond to that threat? How to restore fire dynamics? So not only reducing the risk of high severity fire, but increasing the use of and reaping the benefits of fire as a process in these systems. Carbon sequestration is a challenge. We're trying to increase carbon sequestration, but at the same time, there are a lot of things pushing in the other direction. So how to manage that along with all of these other pieces of the objectives of these two systems. Next slide, please. So between forest and fire and biodiversity, the kinds of questions we're addressing are things like habitat dynamics, what's happening with habitat conditions that support various species and biodiversity overall. Are there climate tolerances that we see that will put some species more at risk than others? And how does that change the ability of those species and communities to perform important forest functions that we rely on in terms of a variety of ecosystem services? And finally, reforestation, not just in terms of how to reforest, how dense or to plant the trees or the configurations, but also like the sources, what species and what sources of those seeds and seedlings based on how genetics are driving the ability of species and families within species to adapt and be adaptive to climate change over time. Next slide, please. And finally, this linkage between biodiversity and land and water. So again, but from an aquatic perspective, what are some of the habitat dynamics and species that really crossover between terrestrial and aquatic systems, water dynamics in terms of snow retention and melt, and how that affects species stress and viability over time, and population sizes, climate tolerances in terms of species, invasive species and their ability to not only affect biota, but also water and fire. And finally, wetland integrity and function, really important, really ties together these systems as a whole between forests and downstream uses, and in terms of water, carbon, and biodiversity. Next slide, please. I believe this is my last slide. I think that, one of the things I wanted to touch on here is so what does implementation look like? And our intention is to sort of aggressively pursue, to the degree possible, the resources that are going to be needed to implement research, both funding, research capacity, partners, in order to build and implement a really active research program directed at upland ecosystems across the basin. This will be a fairly new push for the basin and our science management partners. And we really feel like we're doing that in concert with the Lake Tahoe Science to Action Plan, and in concert with our partners as a whole. So we're very excited about ramping this up and really integrating it with our understanding of what's happening with the lake and how to manage these systems as an ecosystem. We're co-designing and delivering research with managers, partners, stakeholders. A very important focus on that. In fact, it can't be done without that. A focus on research that's helping us understand how management actions can affect outcomes. So making a very outcome-oriented, relatively applied research agenda, but rounded with, basic research, fundamental research that really helps us understand mechanisms, as Jeff had pointed out, and then also tools and techniques to deliver science so that it's readily applicable to the problems at hand. An emphasis on active learning is really important. Adaptive management means co-designing, not just co-designing research, but co-designing management in order to enhance the speed and relevance of research findings. And also monitoring. Monitoring is often treated as an optional luxury. There's no money to support it, that we have to work within limited budgets, and that getting the work on the ground done is more important. And getting the work done on the ground is very important. However, as we're facing a really uncertain future and a novel future, monitoring just really isn't, can't afford not to monitor, because we need to be able to understand what's happening in these systems, why it's happening, and that we can respond to those changes in a timely manner. So the systems that we depend on and their services remain as intact as possible. So there's a big push for us in the next 5 years to better understand how to position research, how to implement it in an effective and expedited way in order to inform management, and really sort of help us see where we're going over the next number of decades. So with that, thank you all very much, and I'll turn it back over to someone.
Thanks so much, Pat and Jeff. We're getting some good questions coming in from participants. And just a reminder, for those joining us, you can ask a question or share an observation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But I wanted to ask you, Jeff and Pat, each a question. Pat, you make the point, and Jeff too, that there are these global planetary temperature changes that are impacting the lake. And while Nevada and California are doing their part to reduce carbon pollution, stabilize the atmosphere, there's not a lot we ourselves can do to very specifically impact air temperatures and their impact on the ecosystems. That being said, there's some management actions that have proven successful in the past. Jeff, I think about the lake, and as Bob pointed out, actually, disallowing the sewage to go into the lake being the most obvious example. Or Pat, moving away from really extractive practices on the landscape. From where we sit now, I want to ask you a challenging question, which is, if you had a magic wand and could tell our agencies or our state and federal agencies what we should be doing to maintain the health of the lake and the health of the upland ecosystems, and it could be even just funding more science to improve the understanding, what should we be doing? Jeff, you get to serve as a governor for the day of both Nevada and and California, or at least leading our agencies. What would you and your colleague scientists have us do as it relates to lake quality?
Well, beyond requesting more funds and more science, one of the latent threats, and it's a big threat, is the loss of oxygen because of climate change. The lake stratifies more, it doesn't mix, oxygen doesn't get down to the bottom. So no, it's not practical to add oxygen to a deep lake like Tahoe, which is something that is done in shallower lakes and reservoirs. The thing that drives oxygen demand is decomposition of organic material that enters the lake. And so, whereas the TMDL, it addressed both nutrients and fine particles, but placed more emphasis on fine particles because they had a bigger impact on clarity. I think we need to look at the reducing nutrient inputs to the lake. If you have less nutrients, you have less biological growth, less decomposition, and what you're doing is extending the time period that it would take for that oxygen to be lost. I mean, there will be extreme events in the future, and there will be deep mixing events in the future, although not as common as they've been in the past, and that will renew the oxygen. What we have to do is give the lake some breathing room, so to speak, to make it be able to last possibly 20 or 30-year periods without mixing. So that's where I would put your money, Brad, Wade, and Brad's too.
And yeah, mostly Brad's money. And what, just for the lay person, is an example of a nutrient that could find its way into the lake? How is that? What does that mean?
Well, we were classified as nitrogen and phosphorus, but say the sorts of things, if you're a homeowner close to the lake, then clearly not using excessive nutrients, fertilizer on your lawns. Pat's talking about large-scale forest management. I think looking at the impacts of those on nutrient additions to the lake is something that I'm sure she's aware of, and the people working on that are aware of. So there are tools at our disposal, but it's sort of nutrients as opposed to a focus on particles, not discounting particles, but nutrients afresh.
That's really helpful. That's a really practical, good suggestion. Pat, over to you. What would you, again, with that magic wand, enable management agencies to do to maintain and restore upland ecosystems?
Yeah, I'd love to have that magic wand. And I think we're all yielding. It's just not quite as big and fast as we'd like it to be. I think, a simple suggestion is of course that a combination of really investing in better models to help us understand some of the dynamics that are still a little bit opaque to us in terms of understanding what sort of actions will result in what sorts of outcomes and over what time frame. But really, the whole purpose of that would be to really support the increasing the pace and scale of management across the landscape. And I think so that would be forest management, of course, or thinning, increasing the amount of fire on the landscape, which is challenging for a variety of reasons in order to be able to control it, but also I think the public in the basin is becoming more and more supportive of the use of fire as a really important integral part of these systems and as a tool. But there's still sort of progress to be made there, I guess. And then integrating forest management with wetland restoration. So I think there's some really great modeling techniques and new ways in which we can understand these system dynamics and then track them to really guide our investments in both wetland restoration, stream restoration, and forest restoration as an integrated set of inputs. So I feel like that's really incredible approach that we could take that would be quite a step forward. We tend to approach these different system objectives independent of one another, and I think one of the things that's sort of a limitation there is understanding how best to sort of pair those up, and that's, I think, a place where research can make a difference, and also understanding kind of the risks that we take to gain benefits. So there's always concern about, are we managing too much? Are we taking out too much wood? Are we, what's this going to have in terms of impacts of sediment? That tends to hold us back. So that's why these sort of models and investments and research are really important partnership with management. And then the final thing I'll say is, in terms of monitoring, I do think that no matter how well we can populate these models, as Jeff, I think, put it so well, with empirical data to help us understand and predict what will happen, there's always uncertainty. And so how do we cope with that uncertainty? Not only in terms of not having all the information, but not knowing exactly how climate is going to change or how species and systems are going to respond to that, is a system of monitoring. And that means tracking conditions over time in a really intelligent and smart way that we can respond to, that we're prepared to respond to. And there's a variety of ways in which we can do that. But I think that the last thing I'll say is that really, it's a new realm, I think, for managers as well as scientists, but maybe managers even more, to be able to grapple with and with a lot of scientific information that is so important, and translating that into how we understand what our expectations are for the future of these systems. So anyway, I think those partnerships are really important, and thanks for the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on that point you made about uncertainty and adaptive management, but I'll mention that, boy, a couple weeks ago, I was headed to a field visit in the Eastern Sierra, going over 89 from South Lake to toward Markleyville, and I saw a sign on the side of the road that said, prescribed fire or planned fire in progress, don't call 911, which I thought was really helpful, seeing the prescribed fire in action. It's also good to know that there's a growing support for getting that, low level fire on the landscape, which of course, our tribal leaders and communities use since time immemorial. So really exciting on that. Brad, I want to put this question to you, and it's a tough one. There's all sorts of uncertainty given climate change. And, at some point I worry that, if we try to get the science perfect, it's sort of paralysis by analysis. At the same time, we want to avoid any, unintended consequence of taking actions, where there is some uncertainty. So, as a leading Nevada's agency where you're putting investments in managing resources, how do you balance the need to, experiment at some level or get some management practices on the landscape or in the lake and then adapt, versus, waiting for more scientific certainty?
Thanks for the question, Wade. It's a very good one. I'm a strong believer in good data leads to good policy, and therefore hopefully good management. And that's what we want to do in Tahoe. Good management is always a little bit complicated in Tahoe because of the various jurisdictions we have up there. And we want to make sure that everyone's operating on a similar set or the same set of data, informing those actions around the lake. Historically, Nevada has not done as much science as I would like to underscore their policy decisions and their statutory work, but that is changing. We have a strategic climate plan statewide for the first time that has a nexus to Tahoe, and we have targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions and to mitigate climate, all of which apply to Tahoe. But we got to look at we got to have the scientists help tell us what's within our control and not within our control. And the things that are within our control, we want good data driving the management decisions related to those things. And I really appreciate what Jeff said about some strategic things we can do to help with clarity that have a broader impact on the connection to the ecosystem. And Pat's point about integration and taking an ecosystem or basin-wide approach is imperative. But there's big management decisions about major prescribed fire, and then there's smaller things that make a big difference. Picking up on Jeff's point, like when the municipalities decide to clean their streets, don't do it right after a storm event, because you're going to get all that all the chemicals or what have you, what the salt and what they put down on the street to in advance of a storm, you don't want those going into the lake. So little things can make a big difference, and I think we need to integrate that into our daily actions.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think about it as, what can science leaders like the two here today tell us about what are the no regrets actions that we can take? For example, reducing the level of nutrients into the lake. Is that something that we don't know exactly how it will interact with clarity, but it just makes sense because it's a no regret action? Or getting more safe prescribed fire on the landscape, same. So I'm all for what it's worth, given, climate impacts are accelerating, I'm all for getting those no regret actions moving and then adaptively managing. And I think the benefit of TSAC, this advisory council, is our scientists can be along there with us. And as we get those management responses online, they can help us and they can tell us how they're working so we can adapt if needed. A couple good questions came in, one for each scientist here. Question for Jeff. So with the peak of the runoff in the basin moving earlier in the year with more rain than snow into January, would the yearly fluctuation of water level in the lake increase? In other words, sort of greater fluctuation? If so, what are the potential water quality impacts in the lake with this climate change effect?
Well, that is a good question. And yes, they would increase because what we're losing is the storage factor embedded in the snowpack. So it's going to be stored in the lake, and the lake literally has 6.5 feet of storage between its natural rim and the top of the dam. More importantly, and this is where I kick it back to you and maybe more so to Brad, is that when the lake fills earlier in the season, January, February, as opposed to July or August, when it does now, suddenly you have control of the releases being in a whole different place. So the releases from Lake Tahoe come from the dam at Tahoe City, and they flow to the Truckee River, which then flows across the state line into Nevada and through Reno, Sparks, and ultimately to Pyramid Lake. So that the Truckee River Operating Agreement is what controls that. And so it's controlled based on current conditions and expectations. How do you at what point should we start thinking about what climate change is going to do to that? Is the water going to be available for the beneficial uses downstream when it traditionally was? So it becomes science, I guess, in a way, not presenting a solution to management, but maybe telling you there's another problem looming that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, thanks for that. And reminding us that of the connection between Tahoe and the Truckee River. Brad.
And Jeff makes a great point, and I'll just respond really quickly. But if our reality is going to be earlier and faster runoff, then we need to acknowledge that reality. We need to make sure our reservoir system downstream from Tahoe is able to manage that in a way that we're not just moving massive quantities of water sooner and just flood irrigating fields or the Great Basin areas beyond Pyramid. We want to make sure that we're able to retain that water so it's used in a beneficial way. And in Nevada, we're a really dry state, and I think both California and Nevada, wasting water is like throwing money out the window. So it's a really important management angle that needs to be focused on. So Jeff, very good point.
Excellent point. Thanks, Sergio, for that question. John asked a question, I think that probably is best answered by Pat. Can water and snow retention be improved by different types of silviculture? In other words, different types of forest management? Or
yes, good question, and the answer is yes, which is there's the work of Adrian Harpold at UNR, University of Nevada, Reno, and his colleague Sebastian Crow have done a fair bit of modeling in the Lake Tahoe Basin, and I've been able to demonstrate, actually developed a tool to show how forest structural characteristics can change snow accumulation and melt dynamics. And this is one of those things that I think is really important for us managing change. So sometimes a little bit of a difference can really make a big difference in terms of drought stress, water availability, timing of availability. So this is something that they've looked at quite a bit. And some of the good news is that increasing forest heterogeneity, we have a focus on that, originally driven by how fire behaves in these systems. So with a more heterogeneous fire or more heterogeneous forest structure, meaning more gaps and clumps and variability, so not all the same, that it helps fire not carry so quickly or move up into the crown so quickly or over such great extents. And so this has been a focus, and we've been patterning this objective of forest heterogeneity based on historical structures that have burned more frequently. And some of the good news we're finding, although this is still work in progress, is the concordance between structural characteristics of forests that are resilient to fire and are promote greater forest health, and those that actually also promote more snow accumulation and slower melt dynamics. So this is a work in progress, but it's a really important area of inquiry that we're very excited about some of the progress that Adrian and his colleagues have made, and applying that directly in the Lake Tahoe Basin, actually first before anywhere else. So.
Wow. Well, for those who are joining us, you're seeing the interaction of scientific understanding and management decisions in real time. And I'm really excited and proud to be part of this effort and supporting the TSAC, the Tahoe Science Advisory Committee, just however we can. In so many ways, you know, the Tahoe Basin and the lake are a microcosm of what we're trying to do across our states, which is conserve an incredible, remarkable natural environment, and one that's vulnerable to climate change, and enable economic prosperity and our communities to thrive. So I'm really excited with this ongoing dynamic. I'm really pleased of the growing connection in our thinking and talking between the science focused on the lake and the science focused on the upland ecosystems. Personally grateful to Dr. Schladow and Dr. Manley and all of the scientists that serve on the TSAC. Bob, big thanks to you for stewarding this nascent organization, and then Brad for your partnership on this and all things. Big thanks to those of you who have joined. Please do look for more of these events where we try to unpack just how science is informing our most important questions of natural resource management in California and the West. Many thanks, and once again, thanks to our panelists, and everyone, please have a great day.